Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
It's one thing to feel pain. It's another to feel abandoned by the person who's supposed to love you most. Rachel had repeated that sentence in her mind so many times it had become a mantra, a bitter truth she couldn't shake. She stared out of her kitchen window, the sunlight streaming through the glass, catching the scar on her abdomen. It was a reminder of the surgery that had changed her life, and of the day her father had chosen someone else over her. It had been 3 years, but the memory felt fresh, raw. Rachel had woken up groggy and disoriented in the hospital bed, her throat dry and her body aching. Machines beeped steadily around her. Nurses moved in and out, and her mother sat quietly by her side, holding her hand. But her father wasn't there. She'd asked about him immediately, her voice barely a whisper. "Where's Dad?" Her mom's face had been tight, her lips pressed together in a way Rachel knew meant she was trying not to say something sharp. "He's not coming, sweetie," she had finally said. "He's on vacation with Carla." Rachel's heart had dropped, her exhaustion replaced by an overwhelming sense of betrayal. "He knew how scared I was. He promised he'd be here." The surgery had been scheduled months in advance, a necessary procedure to remove a benign but potentially dangerous tumor. Rachel had been terrified, not just of the surgery itself, but of what came after. Would she recover fully? Would the tumor come back? The questions had kept her awake at night, and through it all, she had clung to one certainty. Her father would be there for her. Paul had promised. "Of course I'll be there," he'd said during one of their rare phone calls. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." But then Carla, his wife of 7 years, had booked a last-minute vacation to Aruba. Paul had called Rachel the week before her surgery, his tone unusually casual. "Hey, Ratch," he'd said, as if this were a normal conversation. "Listen, about your surgery." Rachel had known immediately that something was wrong. "What about it?" "Well, Carla and I have this trip planned, and it's non-refundable. I'm not sure I can make it." Her stomach had dropped. "You're kidding, right?" "Rachel, it's not like I'm not going to be thinking about you," he'd said, as if that made up for his absence. "But Carla's been looking forward to this for months. It's important to her, and I guess it's not important to you that your daughter is having surgery," Rachel had snapped. There had been a pause, the kind that was filled with unsaid things. Finally, Paul had sighed. "You're being unfair. You've got your mom, right? She'll take care of you. I'll call as soon as you're out." Rachel had hung up without saying another word. The days leading up to her surgery were a blur of anxiety and anger. Every time her phone buzzed, she hoped it was Paul calling to say he'd changed his mind. But it wasn't. When the day finally came, she walked into the hospital with a weight on her chest that had nothing to do with her medical condition. She tried to push the thought of him out of her mind as the nurses prepped her for surgery. But as they wheeled her toward the operating room, all she could think about was how he wasn't there. The emptiness she felt when she woke up was worse than the physical pain. Her father, the man who was supposed to be her rock, had chosen a sunny beach and his second wife over her. 3 years later, the wound still hadn't healed. Rachel had tried to move on, to accept that her relationship with Paul had always been fractured. But every time she thought about that day, the anger bubbled back to the surface. The sound of her phone buzzing on the counter pulled her out of her thoughts. She picked it up and saw his name flashing on the screen, Dad. Her first instinct was to ignore it. She'd ignored his calls and texts before, too angry to face him. But something made her pause. She let the phone ring twice more before answering. "Hello," she said, her voice clipped. "Rachel," Paul said, his voice tentative. "I've been trying to reach you. I think we need to talk." Rachel clenched her jaw, her grip tightening on the phone. "What is there to talk about?" "Please, just hear me out," Paul said. "I know I hurt you, and I want to make things right. Can we meet? Just to talk." Rachel hesitated, her emotions warring inside her. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him there was nothing he could say to fix what he'd done. But another part of her, a quieter, more vulnerable part, needed to hear what he had to say. "Fine," she said at last. "But don't expect me to forgive you." Paul was silent for a moment before replying, his voice heavy. "Thank you, Rachel. I'll text you the details." As she hung up, Rachel felt a strange mix of dread and curiosity. What could he possibly say to undo the damage he'd caused? Rachel agrees to meet Paul, setting the stage for a confrontation years in the making. Would his explanation bring closure, or would it deepen the rift between them? Rachel sat in the corner of her couch, knees tucked under her chin, her phone balanced on the armrest beside her. Paul's text message stared back at her like a ghost from the past. "Let's meet Friday at 6. Just to talk." It felt surreal seeing those words. He had been silent for so long, years slipping by without so much as an apology, and now, out of the blue, he wanted to talk. Her first instinct was to ignore him. She'd done it before. Missed calls, unanswered texts. Every unacknowledged attempt on his part had felt like her way of taking control, of asserting herself against the tidal wave of disappointment he'd caused. But this time felt different. This time, he wasn't just reaching out. He wanted a conversation, a chance to explain himself. The anger she'd carried for so long bubbled up as she thought about it. What did he think a simple talk could fix? Did he really think a half-hearted explanation would make up for missing her surgery, for prioritizing a vacation with Carlo over her? Her chest tightened at the memory. Growing up, she had always fought for his attention, hoping one day he would see her as someone worth showing up for. Instead, he drifted further away, his focus shifting to his new wife and her endless needs. Rachel couldn't remember the exact moment she stopped expecting him to put her first, but she remembered the moments that had led to it. When her parents divorced, Paul had been attentive, trying to soften the blow with weekend visits and promises that nothing would change. At first, she believed him. He'd taken her to the park, stayed for her piano recitals, and reminded her that she was still his little girl. But then Carla came into the picture. Carla had been polite at first, always smiling and using that sugary tone adults use with children when they're trying to seem kind. But Rachel wasn't a child for long, and as the years passed, it became clear that Carla wasn't interested in sharing Paul's attention. He began skipping weekends, claiming work emergencies that didn't add up. Vacations that were supposed to be for him and Rachel were canceled or quietly transformed into trips for him and Carla. When she was 12, Rachel remembered begging him to stay for her birthday dinner instead of leaving early to meet Carla for a work event. He'd kissed her on the forehead and promised to make it up to her, leaving her to blow out the candles without him. She'd stopped asking for anything after that. Now, decades later, she sat in the same emotional purgatory, unsure whether to keep him at arm's length or let him explain himself. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at the door. She stood and opened it to find Maggie, holding 2 cups of coffee and a knowing look on her face. "I figured you'd need this," Maggie said, handing one of the cups to Rachel as she stepped inside. Rachel gave a weak smile. "You're a mind reader." Maggie plopped onto the couch, kicking off her shoes. "All right, Spill. What's going on?" Rachel sat down, her shoulders slumping. "It's my dad. He wants to meet." Maggie's eyebrows shot up. "Your dad? The same dad who missed your surgery? The same dad you've been ignoring for 3 years?" Maggie leaned forward, her expression serious. "And what do you want to do?" "I don't know," Rachel admitted. "Part of me wants to tell him to shove it, to keep ignoring him like I've been doing. But another part," she hesitated, her voice faltering. "Another part wants to hear him out, to tell him how much he's hurt me." Maggie sipped her coffee, considering her words carefully. "Look, Ratch, you don't owe him anything. Not your time, not your forgiveness, nothing. But if you think hearing him out would give you closure, maybe it's worth it." Rachel sighed, setting her coffee on the table. "I don't even know what closure means anymore. I feel like no matter what he says, it won't change anything. He missed the most important day of my life because of her. Because of Carla." "Then tell him that," Maggie said firmly. "Tell him exactly how you feel. Get it off your chest, even if it doesn't change anything for him. Do it for you." Rachel sat in silence, her mind racing. Maggie was right. She didn't owe Paul forgiveness. But maybe she owed it to herself to finally speak her truth, to make him understand the damage he'd done. Later that evening, after Maggie left, Rachel stared at her phone, her heart pounding as she reread his message. Her thumb hovered over the screen, and with a deep breath, she typed a reply. "Fine, I'll meet you, but don't expect me to forgive you." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The response came back almost instantly. "Thank you. I'll see you Friday." Rachel placed her phone down and leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling. She didn't know what happened during their meeting, but one thing was certain. Paul was about to hear the truth, and she wasn't going to hold back. Rachel agrees to meet Paul, setting the stage for an emotional confrontation where long-buried truths will finally come to light. The small coffee shop was buzzing with quiet conversation and the hum of an espresso machine. Rachel sat at a corner table, her fingers drumming on the wooden surface. She hated how nervous she felt. She wasn't here to make amends or smooth things over. She was here to tell Paul exactly how much he'd hurt her. The door opened, and Paul walked in, scanning the room until his eyes landed on her. He offered a tentative smile as he made his way over. Rachel didn't smile back. "Hey, Ratch," he said as he pulled out the chair across from her. "Paul," she replied curtly, dropping the formality of dad. The tension was immediate. Paul hesitated, then sat down, resting his hands awkwardly on the table. He looked older than she remembered, his hair thinner and streaked with more gray, but Rachel didn't feel sorry for him. "You look good," he said, breaking the silence. "I mean healthy. How have you been?" Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Cut the small talk. We both know why we're here." Paul blinked, taken aback by her tone. "Right? Okay." He cleared his throat and leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry. I know I let you down, Rachel. I've thought about it every day since." "Stop," Rachel interrupted, her voice cold. "You didn't just let me down, Paul. You abandoned me. You chose a vacation over being there for me when I needed you the most. So don't sit here and act like you've been losing sleep over it." Paul's face fell. "It's not like that. I didn't realize how much the surgery meant to you. I thought." "You thought?" Rachel's voice rose, and she leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "You thought it was just another doctor's appointment? You thought I'd be fine waking up in a hospital bed, wondering why my own father didn't care enough to show up." "Rachel, I didn't say I didn't care," Paul said defensively. I was caught between two responsibilities. Carla had been looking forward to that trip for months, and what?" Rachel snapped. "You didn't want to disappoint her?" "Newsflash, Paul. Your daughter was having surgery. You didn't just disappoint me. You broke me." Paul flinched at her words, but Rachel wasn't done. "You've always put her first," she said, her voice shaking. "Always. Ever since she came into your life, I've been nothing but an afterthought." "That's not true," Paul said quietly. "Really?" Rachel shot back. "Let me remind you of all the times you chose Carla over me. Like my 16th birthday, when you promised to take me to dinner, but she wanted to go to that stupid art gala, so you canceled. Or the time I got accepted into my dream college, and you couldn't even bother to show up to the open house because you were in Paris with her. Should I keep going?" Paul looked away, his shoulders slumping. "I'm not proud of those moments. But it wasn't about choosing her over you. It was more complicated than that. It's always more complicated when it comes to you, isn't it?" Rachel said bitterly. "But it's really simple, Paul. You made me feel like I didn't matter. And then, when I needed you the most, you proved it." Paul let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples. "I know I screwed up, Rachel. I know I've made mistakes. But I want to fix this. I want us to move forward." Rachel stared at him, her anger giving way to something colder, disbelief. "Move forward? How? Are you expecting me to just forgive you and pretend everything's fine?" "No," Paul said softly. "I don't expect you to forgive me. But I'm asking for a chance to earn it." Rachel shook her head, her throat tight. "You don't get it, do you? Forgiveness isn't something you can earn. It's something you have to deserve. And right now you don't." Paul sat back, his face etched with regret. "I know I hurt you. But Rachel, there's more to why I wasn't there." "I don't." Rachel cut him off, standing abruptly. "Don't give me excuses. Don't try to twist this into something it's not. You weren't there because you didn't care enough. End of story." "Rachel, wait," Paul said, his voice pleading. But she was already grabbing her bag. She turned to him one last time, her voice steady but cold. "You don't get to rewrite history, Paul. You don't get to decide when it's convenient to be a father." Without waiting for a response, she walked out of the coffee shop, her heart pounding. As the door closed behind her, Rachel felt a mix of emotions swirling in her chest. Anger, sadness, relief. She'd said what she needed to say, but it didn't feel like the closure Maggie had promised. If anything, it left her with more questions than answers. Outside the coffee shop, Rachel's phone buzzed with a message from Paul. "There's something I didn't tell you. Please, just hear me out." She stared at the screen, torn between wanting to block his number forever and needing to know the truth he hinted at. Rachel sat in her kitchen, staring at her phone screen. Paul's text from the day before still sat unread. "There's more I need to tell you. Please, Rachel, just give me a chance." She knew she should ignore it. She'd said her piece, and walking out of that coffee shop had felt like reclaiming a sliver of the power Paul had taken from her. But that single line, vague and pleading, gnawed at her. What else could he possibly have to say? Before she could talk herself out of it, Rachel opened the message and replied, "Fine. Talk." The phone rang almost immediately, startling her. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Rachel," Paul said, his voice heavy with relief. "Thank you for picking up." "Get to the point," she said, her tone sharp. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a sigh. "I wasn't honest with you before. About why I wasn't there." "Let me guess," Rachel interrupted. "Another excuse?" "It was Carla," Paul said quietly. Rachel's stomach turned at the mention of her stepmother's name. "What does Carla have to do with this?" "She didn't want me to go," Paul admitted. She thought the surgery wasn't a big deal, and she didn't think it was worth canceling the trip for. Rachel gripped the edge of the counter, her anger flaring. So what? You just did what she told you? Are you seriously blaming her for your choice? I'm not blaming her, Paul said quickly. But you have to understand, Rachel. I was trying to keep the peace. She can be difficult sometimes, and I didn't want to upset her. Rachel let out a bitter laugh. Difficult? That's how you're going to describe the woman who made you abandon your own daughter. It wasn't that simple, Paul said defensively. You don't know what it's like, Rachel. She's not easy to reason with. And when she's upset, Rachel cut him off, her voice rising. So, you're telling me you prioritized her feelings over mine? Over my surgery? Unbelievable. Paul didn't respond, and the silence only fueled Rachel's anger. You've been doing this for years, she said, her voice shaking. Letting her call the shots, letting her push me aside. And for what? To keep her happy? To avoid an argument? Was it worth it, Paul? Rachel. No, she snapped. I'm done. I'm done listening to your excuses, and I'm done pretending Carla isn't part of the problem. The flashbacks came unbidden as Rachel paced her kitchen, trying to calm the storm brewing inside her. She was 13 the first time she realized Carla didn't like her. It was a family dinner at Paul and Carla's house. A stiff, awkward affair where Rachel had spent most of the evening answering polite but shallow questions from Carla. When she accidentally knocked over her glass, spilling water onto the pristine tablecloth, Carla's tight-lipped smile had vanished. Maybe next time, we should use plastic cups, Carla had said, her tone dripping with condescension. Paul had chuckled nervously and made a joke to diffuse the tension, but he hadn't defended Rachel. He never did. Over the years, it became a pattern. Carla would say or do something dismissive, and Paul would look the other way. Like the time Rachel's college graduation conflicted with Carla's weekend plans, and Paul had chosen to go on the trip instead of attending the ceremony. Or the time Rachel had invited him to Thanksgiving dinner, only for Carla to veto it at the last minute. Carla's influence was subtle but constant, like a shadow creeping into every corner of Rachel's life. And Paul always chose her. Rachel's hands were still trembling when she arrived at the family barbecue the following weekend. She hadn't planned to go. She usually avoided these gatherings, but something inside her snapped after that phone call. She needed answers, and she wasn't going to get them by avoiding the problem. Paul was standing near the grill when she arrived, laughing with Carla. Rachel felt a surge of anger as she watched him, so carefree, as if nothing had happened. Rachel, Carla called out, her tone bright and insincere. We weren't expecting you. Rachel ignored her, marching straight up to Paul. We need to talk? Paul's smile faltered. Now. Yes, now, Rachel said, her voice loud enough to draw a few curious glances from the other guests. Carla stepped closer, her smile fading into a frown. Rachel, is everything okay? Don't, Rachel said, turning to face her. You don't get to pretend like everything's fine. I know what you did, Carla. I know you pressured him into missing my surgery. The color drained from Carla's face, but she quickly recovered, crossing her arms. I don't know what you're talking about. You don't? Rachel snapped. Because Paul just admitted it. He told me how you convinced him to put your stupid vacation ahead of me. Carla's expression hardened, and she turned to Paul. You told her that? Paul stammered, clearly caught off guard. I didn't mean... Don't you dare throw me under the bus, Paul, Carla hissed. This was your decision, not mine. Rachel let out a harsh laugh. Oh, I see. Now you're both trying to blame each other. Typical. The argument escalated, the three of them talking over each other as the other guests pretended not to notice. Finally, Paul held up his hands, his voice cutting through the chaos. Enough, he shouted. He turned to Rachel, his face red with frustration. This isn't helping anything. Carla isn't the villain here. I made the decision, Rachel. It's on me. Rachel stared at him, her chest tight. You're still defending her. After everything, you're still choosing her. Paul didn't answer, and in that moment, Rachel felt something inside her break. She turned and walked away, her vision blurred with tears. As Rachel drives away, she wonders if Paul's loyalty to Carla will always come at her expense. Can their relationship ever be repaired, or is it time to walk away for good? The steady hum of the dishwasher filled Rachel's apartment as she sat at the dining table, nursing a cup of tea that had long gone cold. She stared blankly at the steam rising, her mind replaying the scene at the barbecue. Her father's voice echoed in her head, sharp and defensive. Carla isn't the villain here. I made the decision, Rachel. It's on me. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Of course, it's on you, Paul. It's always been on you. A knock at the door startled her. Rachel stood and opened it to find Maggie, holding a small box of pastries and wearing her usual empathetic expression. "I figured you could use some company," Maggie said, stepping inside. Rachel managed a weak smile. "You're too good to me." Maggie set the pastries down and gestured toward the couch. "Come on, spill." They settled in, and Rachel recounted the confrontation with Paul and Carla, her voice thick with frustration and exhaustion. Maggie listened quietly, nodding at the right moments, her brow furrowed in concern. When Rachel finished, Maggie leaned back, crossing her arms. "Wow, that sounds like a mess." "That's putting it lightly," Rachel muttered, rubbing her temples. Maggie tilted her head, her tone gentle but probing. "How are you feeling?" "About Paul, I mean. Not Carla. She's a whole other can of worms." Rachel sighed, sinking deeper into the cushions. "I don't even know anymore. Part of me wants to cut him off completely, just be done with it. But then I think about everything he said. The apology, the explanations. What if he's actually sorry? What if he's trying to make things right? And that makes you angry," Maggie said knowingly. Rachel's eyes flicked to her, startled. "Yeah, how'd you know?" "Because it's easier to be mad," Maggie said softly. "If he's just a bad guy, you don't have to deal with the possibility that he might actually care. But if he's genuine, that's more complicated." Rachel nodded slowly, her throat tightening. "He hurt me so many times, Maggie. Not just the surgery, my whole life. How do you come back from that? How do you forgive someone who made you feel like you didn't matter?" Rachel's mind wandered back to her childhood, to the years that followed her parents' divorce. Her mother had left suddenly, packing a few bags and disappearing across the country with barely a goodbye. Rachel had been 8, confused and scared, clinging to Paul like he was her only lifeline. For a while, he had been everything she needed. He cooked her favorite meals, helped her with her homework, and tucked her in at night with whispered reassurances that everything would be okay. But as the years passed, his warmth cooled. He stopped asking about her day. He missed her school plays. When Carla came into the picture, it was like Paul had handed his attention over to her and never looked back. One memory stood out sharply. She was 11, sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of math problems she didn't understand. Paul was supposed to help her, but Carla had called from the other room, her voice shrill and impatient. "Paul, can you come here for a second?" He'd hesitated, glancing at Rachel. "I'll be back in a minute, kiddo." But he never came back. Rachel had sat there for hours, struggling through the homework alone, her frustration turning to quiet tears. That night, she promised herself she'd stop relying on him. And she had, at least, as much as a child could. Back in the present, Rachel blinked, snapping out of the memory. Maggie was watching her, waiting. "I just don't know if I can trust him," Rachel said finally. "Even if he is sorry, how do I know he won't hurt me again?" "You don't," Maggie said simply. "But maybe this isn't about trust. Maybe it's about letting go of some of that anger, for your own sake." Rachel frowned. "You think I should forgive him?" "I think forgiveness is more for you than for him," Maggie said. "I'm not saying you have to forget what he did, or even let him back into your life. But carrying this anger around forever? That's only going to hurt you, Ratch." Rachel stared at her tea, her thoughts swirling. Later that night, Rachel was rummaging through an old box of photos and keepsakes when her fingers brushed against something unexpected. She pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age, her name scrawled across the front in Paul's handwriting. Her heart raced as she opened it, unfolding a single sheet of paper. "Dear Rachel," it began. "I know I haven't been the best dad lately. Things have been hard, and I don't always know how to handle it. But I want you to know that I love you more than anything, even if I don't always show it. I'm trying, kiddo. I hope one day you'll understand." Rachel's breath hitched as she reread the letter. It wasn't much, and it didn't erase the years of pain, but it was something. A reminder that maybe, just maybe, Paul had cared more than she thought. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box, her emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and the faintest glimmer of hope. Holding the old letter, Rachel is left questioning whether she's misjudged Paul entirely, or if the letter is just another reminder of promises he never kept. Rachel sat at a small corner table in the same coffee shop where she confronted Paul just days ago. This time, the air felt different, less charged with anger, but no less heavy. Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup as she waited, the letter she'd found still fresh in her mind. The door chimed, and Paul entered. He looked tired, his shoulders slightly hunched as though carrying a weight he'd been unable to set down. His eyes met hers, and he offered a small, hesitant smile. She didn't smile back. He approached the table slowly, pulling out the chair across from her. "Thanks for meeting me again," he said softly. Rachel shrugged, leaning back in her seat. You said you had more to say. So say it. Paul clasped his hands together on the table, taking a deep breath. I don't know where to start. There's so much I should have said to you before, but I didn't. And that's on me. Rachel's jaw tightened. You're right. It is. Paul nodded, swallowing hard. I was a terrible father, Rachel. I can admit that now. After your mom left, I thought I could handle it, being a single parent, taking care of you. But I was scared, and I didn't know what I was doing. Scared? Rachel's voice was sharp. You didn't seem scared when you were off with Carla, ignoring me for years. He winced, but didn't look away. I know it looked that way, and I'm not going to sit here and make excuses. But when Carla came into my life, I thought I could have something stable again. I thought if I could make it work with her, maybe it would make up for everything I'd failed to do for you. Rachel's stomach churned. So, you decided to replace me with her? Great logic, Dad. No, Paul said firmly, his voice cracking. I never wanted to replace you. But I didn't know how to balance things. Carla had expectations, and I chose her. Rachel interrupted, her anger bubbling to the surface. Every single time, you chose her. Do you even know what that felt like? Do you know how many times I cried myself to sleep because I thought I wasn't enough for you? Paul's face crumpled, and for the first time, Rachel saw tears welling in his eyes. Rachel, No, she said, her voice trembling. You don't get to cry. Not here. Not now. You don't get to act like this is news to you. I've been carrying this pain my whole life, and you've been too busy playing house with Carla to notice. Paul wiped at his eyes, his hands shaking. You're right. I wasn't there for you the way I should have been. I failed you, Rachel, over and over again. And I don't expect you to forgive me for that. But I need you to know that it wasn't because I didn't love you. I've always loved you. Rachel let out a hollow laugh, tears stinging her own eyes now. Funny way of showing it. I know, Paul said, his voice barely above a whisper. And I live with that guilt every day. After your surgery, when you stopped answering my calls, I realized just how badly I'd messed up. I thought about coming to see you, but I was too much of a coward. I didn't know how to face you. Coward, Rachel repeated bitterly. Yeah, that sounds about right. Paul looked down at his hands, his voice breaking. Do you know how many nights I've laid awake, wondering what I could have done differently? Wondering if it's too late to fix things? Rachel stared at him, her heart pounding. The rawness in his voice, the visible cracks in his usually stoic demeanor, it caught her off guard. For years, she'd fantasized about confronting him, about making him see the pain he'd caused. Now that it was happening, it didn't feel the way she'd expected. You're right about one thing, she said after a long pause. It might be too late. Some things you can't fix, Paul. Some wounds don't heal. He nodded, his expression one of quiet devastation. I know, but I have to try. For as long as you'll let me, I'll keep trying. Rachel crossed her arms, the weight of his words pressing down on her. I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Paul looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. I understand, but whether you forgive me or not, I'll always be here for you. I promise. Rachel's laugh was bitter. You and your promises. They don't mean much, Paul. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table. This isn't a promise. It's the truth. I wrote this for you a long time ago, but I was too afraid to give it to you. Maybe it doesn't mean anything now, but I want you to have it. Rachel hesitated before picking up the envelope. She didn't open it, instead tucking it into her bag without a word. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this, she said quietly. Do whatever feels right, Paul said, his voice steady now. But just know, I love you, Rachel, and I'm sorry for everything. Rachel stood, the letter weighing heavily in her bag. We'll see, Paul. We'll see. She turned and walked out, leaving him sitting alone at the table. Rachel holds the unopened letter as she walks home, torn between wanting to read it and fearing that whatever it says will either break her heart further or force her to reconsider everything. The letter sat on Rachel's kitchen table, untouched since she dropped it there the night before. The edges of the envelope were slightly frayed from where she had turned it over in her hands, debating whether to open it. She'd barely slept, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Paul's voice replayed in her head. This isn't a promise. It's the truth. She wasn't sure she wanted his truth. For years, she'd built walls to protect herself from the pain he'd caused, from the constant disappointments and broken promises. Reading the letter felt like opening a door she wasn't sure she could close again. Rachel sighed and sat down, her fingers trembling as she picked up the envelope. With a deep breath, she tore it open and unfolded the neatly written pages inside. Dear Rachel, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to write it. I need to say what I couldn't bring myself to say out loud. I've failed you. I know that. I failed you as a father, as someone you should have been able to count on. There are no excuses for the choices I made, but I want you to know that none of it was because I didn't love you. I loved you then, and I love you now. That has never changed. When your mom left, I felt like I had to hold it all together, for you, for myself. But the truth is, I didn't know how. I was scared. I felt like I wasn't enough, like I couldn't give you everything you deserved. And when Carla came into my life, I thought maybe I could have a fresh start. I didn't realize that in trying to build something new, I was leaving you behind. I see it all so clearly now. The birthdays I missed, the promises I broke, the moments I let you down. I can't change the past, Rachel, no matter how much I wish I could. But if I could go back and do it differently, I would. You once asked me why I always chose Carla over you. The truth is, I didn't know how to say no to her. I didn't want to lose her, and I thought I could balance everything. But in trying to keep her happy, I hurt you. I see that now, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I know an apology doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't erase the pain I've caused you. But I hope it means something that I'm trying, that I'm finally owning up to my mistakes. Rachel, I want to be part of your life again. I want to earn your trust, even if it takes the rest of my days. But I'll understand if you can't forgive me. I just needed you to know how deeply sorry I am and how much I love you. Always, Dad. By the time Rachel finished reading, tears were streaming down her face. She wiped them away angrily, frustrated by how much the letter had affected her. She'd expected excuses, maybe even an attempt to shift the blame. But instead, Paul's words had been raw, unflinching in their honesty. And that made it harder. She folded the letter carefully and stared at it for a long time. Maggie's words came back to her. Forgiveness is more for you than for him. But what did forgiveness even look like in a situation like this? Could she let go of the pain without letting Paul back into her life? The next day, Rachel found herself standing on Paul's doorstep, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. She hadn't planned this visit. It was an impulse, a need to see him face to face one last time. Paul opened the door, his expression shifting from surprise to cautious hope. Rachel. She didn't say anything, stepping inside and handing him the letter. He took it, his hands trembling slightly, and looked up at her. The silence between them was thick, laden with unspoken words. Paul's eyes searched hers, but Rachel kept her expression unreadable. I read it, she said finally. Her voice was steady, but there was a sharp edge to it. Paul nodded slowly. And Rachel crossed her arms, glancing around the house she'd once considered a second home. It felt foreign now, more Carla's space than his. She looked back at him, her heart heavy. I don't know what you expect me to say, she admitted. I don't know if I can forgive you, Paul. Not yet. Paul's face fell, but he nodded. I understand. No, you don't, Rachel said, her voice rising slightly. You don't understand how much damage you've done. You don't understand what it's like to carry this weight for years while you moved on with your life. He opened his mouth to respond, but she held up a hand to stop him. I'm not here for an apology. I've heard enough of those. I'm here because I needed you to know how much you hurt me, and I needed to say it to your face. Paul's shoulders slumped, his eyes shining with tears. I'm so sorry, Rachel. I'll never stop being sorry. She took a deep breath, the words she'd rehearsed in her mind dissolving into silence. After a long pause, she turned toward the door. Goodbye, Paul, she said quietly. As she stepped outside, the weight on her chest felt lighter, but not gone. She didn't know if she'd forgiven him, or if she ever would. But for the first time, she felt like she'd reclaimed a piece of herself. Forgiveness isn't always about letting go of the past. Sometimes, it's about deciding what kind of future you want to build. The ending leaves the audience to wonder. Did Rachel walk away for good, or was this the first step toward healing?